The air hung heavy with dust and the scent of sun-baked earth as the little town of Willow Bend stirred to life. It was the kind of place where wagons creaked down a single dirt road, dogs slept under porch rails, and every face was known by name, or at least by rumor. Folks there lived slow, spoke plain, and worked hard, same as the land demanded. But that summer, something dark had settled over the town, something that didn't move with the wind or fade with the sun. It started the morning the boy came running. Down the street, his voice shaking the quiet like a gunshot. "They took my pa, mister," he cried, breathless and wide-eyed, his small boots kicking up a cloud behind him. He couldn't have been more than 10, with a dirt-smudged face and tears cutting lines through the dust. Every door in town seemed to open at once. Men stepped out with hats in hand, women peeked from behind curtains, and even the blacksmith paused mid-swing, the hammer frozen in the air. The boy stopped in the middle of the street, chest heaving. "They took him last night, by the creek road," he managed to say, and for a moment silence fell like a curtain. Then someone whispered what everyone was thinking. "Raiders." Now the people of Willow Bend had seen plenty of hard times, drought, sickness, and the kind of hunger that could hollow a man's eyes. But this was something different. Rumors had drifted in from the hills for weeks. Cattle gone missing, stagecoaches raided, fires in the distance. Some said it was bandits. Others swore it was one of the tribes striking back after the soldiers came through last winter. Whatever the truth was, nobody wanted to say it too loud. The sheriff, a broad man with years of dust ground into his coat, came striding down the boardwalk, his boots thudding with slow authority. "Easy now, boy," he said, crouching down. "Tell me what happened." The boy wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "Pa went out after supper, said he heard the horses carrying on. He didn't come back. I went out at first light and found his hat by the trail. There were tracks, more than one set." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He looked over at the men gathered nearby. "Get your rifles," he said simply. "We're riding." But as the small posse readied to mount up, a lone figure stood apart from the rest, tall, quiet, and motionless as a shadow. He leaned against a hitching post, arms crossed, eyes unreadable beneath the brim of a worn hat. The townsfolk knew him only by rumor. Some said he'd fought with the army once, others that he'd fought against it. His skin bore the bronze hue of the desert, and his hair, long and black as a raven's wing, marked him as Apache. Few in Willow Bend trusted him, but no one dared cross him either. He kept to himself, worked odd jobs, and spoke to no one unless spoken to. Yet when he moved, it was with the quiet certainty of a man who'd seen death and made peace with it. Now, as the sheriff gave orders, the Apache's gaze drifted toward the boy still standing in the street, clutching his father's hat like it was the last piece of him left. Something passed through the man's eyes, something hard to name. Then, without a word, he pushed off the post, walked to his horse, and swung into the saddle. The sheriff frowned. "Don't recall asking for help," he said. The Apache looked down, his voice low and steady. "Didn't ask." And with that, he nudged his horse forward, heading down the road that cut toward the creek. The posse hesitated, but one by one, they followed. The boy trailed behind them for a while, until the sheriff called over his shoulder, "Stay here, son. We'll bring your pa home." But the boy didn't move. He just stood there in the road, hat clutched tight, watching the dust rise behind the riders until they disappeared into the heat shimmer. The trail to the creek was narrow and winding, flanked by mesquite and cottonwood. The sound of cicadas buzzed thick in the air. The Apache rode ahead, his dark eyes scanning the ground. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just watched, listening to the earth like it was whispering secrets only he could hear. After a while, he stopped and slid from his saddle. He crouched low, fingers brushing the dirt. "Tracks," he murmured. 3 horses. One man walked. The sheriff dismounted beside him. "Could be a setup," he muttered. "You sure?" The Apache glanced up, his expression calm. "They took him alive. Drag marks head east." East was bad country, broken canyons and dry riverbeds where even the sun seemed to lose its way. No one went out there unless they had to. But the sheriff nodded, motioning the men forward. They rode on until the shadows stretched long and the first stars began to blink through the fading sky. By the time they reached the edge of the canyon, the air had cooled. The Apache raised a hand, signaling for silence. He slid from his horse again and moved ahead on foot, the others waiting behind. Minutes passed. The sound of the wind through the brush was the only thing that moved. Then came a faint noise, a low moan, carried by the breeze. The Apache froze. He followed the sound down a narrow ravine, every step measured, quiet. And there, half hidden among the rocks, he found a man bound and beaten, shirt torn, wrists raw from rope, the missing father. The Apache knelt, cutting him loose with a knife. "Who did this?" he asked. The man coughed, voice barely more than a whisper. "Didn't see their faces," he rasped. "But they weren't outlaws. Wore badges. Soldiers." The Apache's eyes darkened. He stood slowly, scanning the horizon. The air felt heavy again, like before a storm. Soldiers. That meant the man hadn't been taken by raiders at all. He'd been taken by the very men sworn to keep the peace. By the time the sheriff and his men caught up, the Apache was already leading the wounded man back toward the horses. "We need to move," he said. "They'll be back." But even as he spoke, a gunshot split the night. Echoes bounced off the canyon walls, and a bullet kicked dust at his feet. Another cracked past the sheriff's hat. The riders dove for cover, returning fire into the darkness. The Apache didn't waste time shouting orders. He grabbed the injured man, swung him up onto a horse, and slapped the reins. "Ride!" he barked. They thundered back through the canyon, hooves pounding the earth, gunfire chasing them like angry thunder. When they reached the open plain again, the night had swallowed the town lights far behind them. The sheriff looked over his shoulder, face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "What in God's name was that?" he gasped. The Apache didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, the muscles in his jaw tight. He knew what it meant. He'd seen it before, men with power taking what they wanted and calling it law. When they finally stopped to rest, the boy's father slumped weakly in the saddle, half conscious. The sheriff tried to speak, but the Apache cut him off with a quiet look. "You want to save this town?" he said softly. "Then stop looking for bandits in the desert. The danger's closer than you think." The sheriff didn't know what to say. The desert stretched around them, endless and silent, the stars watching coldly from above. Somewhere behind, the echo of hooves still whispered in the dark. The boy's father stirred, eyes fluttering open. "They said it wasn't over," he murmured. "They said more would come." The Apache turned his head toward the sound, every muscle tense. Far off in the direction of the creek, a faint light flickered, like a campfire, or maybe torches. He didn't speak again, but his hand dropped to the handle of his knife. The sheriff followed his gaze, and in that moment, both men knew the same truth. Whatever had started out there in the hills wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The wind rose, carrying the scent of smoke and iron, and the Apache's voice came low, almost to himself. "They took his pa," he said quietly. "Now they'll answer for it." Then he mounted his horse again, eyes fixed on the far horizon, where the light was growing brighter by the second. And as he rode into the darkness, the others followed, not sure what waited for them, only that the lone Apache didn't ask twice. The trail east of Willow Bend stretched into wild country, dry gullies, tangled brush, and red stone cliffs that caught the first light of dawn. The riders moved slow now, the horses spent from the hard run through the night. Dust clung to their clothes and their eyes burned from lack of sleep. No one spoke much. The only sound was the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves against the hard ground. The boy's pa, weak and half-conscious, rode slumped over the saddle, his breath shallow. Every so often he stirred and muttered something under his breath, words no one could make out. The sheriff rode close beside him, keeping the man from falling, but his eyes drifted often toward the Apache leading up front. He still didn't quite trust him, but after what happened back in the canyon, he didn't have much choice. The Apache had known which way to ride when the shooting started, had known where the ambush would come from before anyone else did. At first light, they stopped near a small spring, the only sign of water for miles. The Apache knelt by the creek bed, washing the dust from his face and hands. The sheriff crouched beside him, rubbing his jaw. "You seem to know a lot about this country," he said finally. The Apache didn't look up. "I was born not far from here," he said quietly. That answer hung in the air for a moment. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Then you know who might have done this?" The Apache's eyes lifted slowly, dark and still. "I know who would," the sheriff frowned. "You mean soldiers?" "Not all soldiers," the Apache said. "But men who wear the same coats. They come from the fort across the ridge. They say they bring peace, but peace to them means silence. Anyone who asks questions disappears." The sheriff's brow furrowed. "That doesn't make sense. Why take a rancher?" The man never bothered anyone. The Apache turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun bled red through the clouds. Maybe he saw something he shouldn't have. The sheriff didn't answer. He just looked back at the others, who were tending the horses and trying to start a small fire for coffee. The boy's father lay propped against a saddle, his face pale. The boy had followed them after all. He'd shown up at the edge of town right before they rode out, refusing to stay behind. The sheriff had wanted to send him back, but the Apache had simply said, "Let him come." There'd been something in his voice that made the sheriff hold his tongue. Now the boy sat beside his pa, whispering softly, trying to keep him awake. The Apache watched them for a moment, then walked over and crouched down beside the wounded man. "You remember what they said?" he asked gently. The man nodded weakly. "They said, it was about the wagons," he whispered. "Big ones covered, moving west at night. Didn't want nobody to see. What was in them?" The Apache asked. "Didn't see, but I heard the sound, metal. Chains maybe. I don't know." He coughed hard, clutching his chest. The boy steadied him, eyes wide with fear. The sheriff frowned. "Chains? That doesn't sound like army supply wagons." The Apache stood, his face unreadable. "No, it doesn't." The wind picked up, stirring the dry grass. Far off, a hawk circled high, crying out once before drifting out of sight. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath. They stayed by the creek a while longer, long enough for the boy's father to drink and rest. The sheriff used the time to check the rifles and count what ammunition they had left. It wasn't much. "If whoever's behind this has soldiers with them, we're outnumbered," he said quietly. The Apache just nodded. "We won't fight them here. We'll find proof first." "Proof of what?" the sheriff asked. The Apache looked toward the east again. "That the army isn't who they say they are." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment. "That's a big claim, friend." "Then let's find out if it's true." They set out again after noon, moving slower to keep the wounded man steady. The sun climbed high, burning the land until it shimmered. Every so often the Apache would stop, crouch and read the ground like it was a book. Once he picked up a piece of rope half buried in the dust, military issue, stiff and worn. He handed it to the sheriff without a word. As the day wore on, they came to a dry gulch where wagon ruts cut deep into the earth. The Apache dismounted and knelt beside them. The ruts were fresh. "They passed through here 2 nights ago," he said. "Headed where?" the sheriff asked. The Apache pointed toward a line of dark hills in the distance. "There's an old trading post out that way. Been empty for years." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "And you think that's where they're holding folks?" The Apache's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "If they're still alive." The boy's hands clenched around his father's hat. "He ain't dead," he said fiercely. "They wouldn't take him just to kill him." The Apache looked down at him, eyes softening for just a moment. "No," he said. "They wouldn't." That night they camped in the shadow of a low ridge. The stars came out bright and cold, and the fire crackled low. The sheriff took first watch, his rifle laid across his knees. The others slept, though the boy stayed close to his father, who drifted in and out of uneasy dreams. The Apache sat apart, staring into the fire. The flames flickered across his face, tracing the lines of old scars and quiet memories. After a while, the sheriff spoke without looking at him. "You got a name, friend?" The Apache's voice was low. "Not one I use anymore." The sheriff shifted. "You fought in the wars, didn't you?" The Apache didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the coals before he finally said, "I fought for my people. Then I fought for yours. Seems neither side much won." The sheriff gave a small nod. "I knew a few like you, good men. Didn't deserve what came after." The Apache looked up, his eyes hard. "No one ever does." The sheriff sighed and looked out at the dark hills. "You think we'll find those wagons tomorrow?" "If we don't," the Apache said quietly, "they'll find us." Before dawn, a noise woke them, a distant rumble like thunder. The Apache was already on his feet, rifle in hand. He climbed the ridge and crouched low, scanning the land below. Dust was rising from the valley, a column moving slow and steady. Wagons. He motioned for the sheriff to join him. Together they watched as the shapes came into view. 3 large wagons covered in canvas drawn by mules. A handful of riders flanked them, their silhouettes dark against the pale morning light. Even from a distance the sheriff could see the glint of rifles. "Looks like army," he muttered. The Apache didn't move. "Maybe," he said. "But those aren't supply wagons." The sheriff squinted. "You sure?" The Apache pointed. "Look how heavy they sit on the wheels. Too heavy for food or ammunition. Whatever's in there, it's alive, or was." The sheriff's throat went dry. "We can't take them head on." The Apache nodded. "We don't have to. We follow." They shadowed the wagons from the ridge, keeping low among the rocks. The boy stayed behind with his father, hidden in a small ravine. The men moved quiet, careful not to be seen. The wagons wound their way through the narrow pass, heading straight toward the old trading post just as the Apache had guessed. By the time they reached the edge of the post, the sun was high. The place looked abandoned, walls half fallen, roof caved in, but smoke rose from behind it. The Apache and sheriff crept closer, moving between the stones. Through the cracks they saw men unloading the wagons. It wasn't supplies they were handling. It was crates, heavy ones marked with no insignia. The Apache signaled for silence, then motioned toward a shadowed corner where 2 guards stood smoking and talking low. "Said the captain's making another run by the river next week," one said. "Don't see why we gotta hide it out here," the other grumbled. "If folks in town find out, they won't," the first one cut in sharply. Orders came from up top. "You keep quiet and you'll get your share." The sheriff's jaw tightened. The Apache leaned close and whispered, "They're smuggling something. Maybe weapons." The sheriff nodded slowly, eyes narrowing. "Or prisoners." Just then a sudden sound broke the quiet, the distant whinny of a horse. The guards snapped their heads up, hands flying to their rifles. The sheriff froze. The Apache's hand went to his knife, but it was too late. One of the guards shouted toward the others, "We're not alone!" In an instant the camp came alive with noise, men shouting, boots pounding, rifles being loaded. The Apache grabbed the sheriff by the arm. "Go," he hissed. "Back to the horses!" They ran low through the ruins, bullets cracking past them, dust and splinters flying. The sheriff ducked behind a wall, returning fire, but there were too many of them. The Apache pulled him toward the ridge. Behind them, the wagons rattled as someone yelled for pursuit. The Apache's horse whinnied from below, stamping in panic. They reached the bottom just as the boy's father called out weakly, "What's happening?" The Apache swung into his saddle and looked back toward the post, where black smoke was already starting to rise. "They know we're coming now," he said. The sheriff climbed up beside him, breathless. "Then what do we do?" The Apache looked east, where the desert opened wide and unforgiving. "We ride," he said, "and we don't stop till we find the truth." The boy held tight to his father's arm as the group spurred their horses forward, dust billowing behind them. The trading post faded into the distance, swallowed by the heat and smoke. None of them spoke for a long time. The land stretched empty and silent, but each of them felt the same thing, the uneasy weight of what they'd seen, and the certainty that the real fight was still ahead. As the sun sank low, the Apache turned his head toward the fading light and said quietly, almost to himself, "They took more than one man out here," and in that moment, the sheriff understood. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about one missing rancher anymore. Something far bigger was moving beneath the surface, and the lone Apache meant to uncover it, no matter what it cost. The wind picked up again that night, dry and restless, sweeping across the open plains like something alive. The small group made camp near a cluster of cottonwoods, the only shelter for miles. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that trembled across the dust. No one said much. They were all thinking about what they'd seen, the wagons, the soldiers, the crates with no markings. Whatever was inside those boxes, it wasn't meant for good. The sheriff sat apart, oiling his rifle in silence. His jaw worked tight, eyes fixed on the flames. The boy's father slept fitfully beside the fire, his face still pale, a shallow cut on his temple catching the light now and then. The boy had fallen asleep leaning against him, one hand gripping the brim of his father's hat like he was afraid it might disappear too. The Apache sat a little ways off, sharpening his knife. The sound of stone against steel was steady, almost calming, but the sheriff could tell his mind was anywhere but calm. After a long stretch of silence, the sheriff said quietly, "You figure those soldiers are from Fort Garrison?" The Apache's eyes stayed on the blade. "Yes," he said. Why would the army run wagons like that out here in secret? Because they don't want people to see what's inside, the Apache said simply. The sheriff frowned. You think it's weapons? Supplies? The Apache paused, glancing toward the boy's sleeping father. Could be both, or neither. He slid the knife back into its sheath. There's something more they're hiding, the sheriff leaned forward. You said earlier you were born near here. You ever seen anything like this before? The Apache's face hardened, his voice turning low. Once when I was a boy. They came through my village, said they were bringing peace, took men away in wagons. My father was one of them. None ever came back. The sheriff's mouth went dry. He looked at him for a moment, then down at his boots. I'm sorry, he muttered. The Apache said nothing. The fire popped softly between them, sparks drifting up into the black sky. When dawn came, they broke camp early, heading north where the ground rose toward a line of rocky hills. The Apache led them along an old trail that wound between cliffs, shaded by scrub and sage. The sheriff rode behind, trying to keep his thoughts from circling too far ahead. He'd served with the army once years back. He knew the way men followed orders, even bad ones. But if what the Apache said was true, this wasn't just a bad order. It was something deeper, something twisted. Around midday, they came across a small cabin half hidden among the rocks. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney. The Apache raised a hand, signaling for quiet. They dismounted and approached on foot. Inside, an old woman sat near the hearth stirring a pot of stew. Her back was bent, her hair long and silver. When she saw them, her eyes widened with fear, but the Apache stepped forward and spoke softly in her language. She relaxed a little, nodding once before motioning them in. The sheriff ducked through the low doorway, the smell of herbs and smoke heavy in the air. The woman ladled stew into wooden bowls and set them down. She and the Apache spoke quietly for a while before he turned to the others. She's seen the wagons, he said. Says they've been moving through the valley for weeks. Always at night, the sheriff frowned. How many? 5, maybe 6, the Apache said. All with guards. She says sometimes she hears shouting from inside the crates. The sheriff's stomach turned. Shouting? The Apache nodded. Men's voices. The boy's father, weak but listening, looked up from where he sat. You think they're taking people? Prisoners? Maybe, the Apache said quietly. Or workers. Forced to haul something through the desert. The woman said something else, her tone darkening. The Apache's expression shifted, his jaw tightening. What did she say? The sheriff asked. She said they're digging, the Apache answered. Out by the mesa. She's heard explosions like blasting powder. The sheriff stared. Digging? For what? The Apache met his eyes. Gold, maybe. Or something the government wants buried. For a moment, no one spoke. The boy's father let out a slow, shaky breath. If they're using soldiers to hide a mine, that's trouble for everyone. The Apache looked toward the door, his eyes narrowing. More than trouble, he said. It means they'll kill anyone who gets too close. They thanked the old woman and left before sunset, heading toward the mesa. The land grew rougher the farther they went, the trail winding through dry washes and jagged stone. When the sun dipped low, they came upon a ridge overlooking the valley below, and there it was. In the fading light, the mesa stood dark and wide, its base surrounded by small fires. Figures moved below, silhouettes against the glow. The Apache handed his spyglass to the sheriff. Look, he said. The sheriff raised it and his jaw tightened. He could see men, soldiers all right, but there were others too. Civilians, thin, ragged, working under guard. They were hauling rock and shoveling dirt, and the ground near them was torn open by a wide pit. Wagons sat nearby, the same kind they'd seen before. The sheriff lowered the glass. They're running a mine, he said, voice flat. And they're using captives to do it. The Apache nodded once. Hidden from the town, hidden from the law. The boy's father clenched his fists. That's why they took me. I saw them moving supplies down by the creek. I knew it wasn't right. The sheriff's face darkened. We can't take them head on, not with those numbers. No, the Apache said. We need proof, enough to bring the army itself down on them. But how? The sheriff asked. The Apache studied the camp below. We wait until nightfall. Then we get close. As darkness settled, the group moved down the ridge, careful to keep low. The boy stayed behind with his father, hidden among the rocks. The Apache and sheriff crept toward the camp, keeping to the shadows. The closer they got, the clearer they could hear. The clang of picks, the crack of whips, and the muffled groans of men too tired to stand. The sheriff's hands curled into fists. "This ain't a mine," he muttered. "It's a prison." The Apache's voice was quiet. "A grave if they have their way." They crept closer still, slipping behind a line of barrels. From there, they could see the pit, deep and wide with torches flickering along its edges. Inside, men worked in chains, swinging hammers and hauling buckets of stone. Among them were faces that looked both white and native, some too young to be there at all. The sheriff's breath caught. "Dear God!" The Apache touched his arm, motioning him back. They retreated toward the shadows, but as they did, a lantern flared nearby. A soldier stepped out from behind a wagon, rifle raised. "Hold it right there," he barked. The Apache didn't hesitate. He moved fast, silent, striking the man's wrist before he could fire. The gun fell, and the Apache caught it midair, pressing the man back against the wagon with one hand over his mouth. The sheriff froze, heart pounding as the soldier's eyes went wide with fear. The Apache leaned close, whispering low. "You speak, you die." The soldier nodded, trembling. The Apache eased his hand away. "Who's in charge here?" he asked quietly. The soldier hesitated. "Captain Hurst," he muttered. "He's the one who started all this. Says it's a government order. From where?" The Apache demanded. The soldier shook his head. "Don't know. Papers come sealed. He just follows orders." The Apache's eyes darkened. "And the men in chains?" "Workers," the soldier said. "They tried to run supplies. Got caught snooping." Hurst said to make an example. The sheriff stepped forward, his face hard. "Where's the captain now?" "In the main tent," the soldier stammered. "Down by the pit." The Apache's hand tightened on the man's collar. "You didn't see us," the soldier nodded frantically. The Apache released him, and he stumbled back into the dark, too scared to look behind him. The sheriff exhaled slowly. "We can't leave them here." The Apache's gaze stayed on the glowing camp. "We won't, but not yet. First, we need the captain." They slipped back toward the ridge, silent as ghosts. When they reached the others, the sheriff's face was grim. "It's worse than we thought," he said. The boy looked up, fear in his eyes. "Pa said they took men before. You think they'll come back to town?" The Apache looked toward the stars, his expression unreadable. "If they mean to keep this secret," he said quietly, "they'll burn the town to the ground before they let anyone talk." The boy's father stirred weakly, gripping his son's hand. "Then we have to stop them," he said. The sheriff nodded slowly. "We will, but not tonight." The Apache's voice was low, calm, but cold as iron. "Tomorrow we go back. I'll find this Captain Hurst, and when I do—" He stopped, looking toward the dark horizon where the fires still burned like eyes in the night. "He'll answer for every man taken." The wind carried the faint sound of hammering from the valley below, echoing across the plains like a heartbeat. No one spoke. They all knew what waited for them come morning, and as the first hint of dawn crept across the desert sky, the lone Apache rose to his feet, his shadow long against the pale earth. The others followed his gaze toward the distant mesa, where secrets were buried deep, and the truth was something worth dying for. Morning came slow and red over the desert, the kind of dawn that felt more like warning than promise. The Apache was already awake before the first light broke the horizon, standing near the ridge where he could still see the faint smoke from the mesa. The others stirred behind him, the sheriff rolling up his bedroll, the boy rubbing sleep from his eyes. The boy's father sat propped against a rock, pale but more alert than he'd been in days. The air felt heavy, filled with a quiet no one dared break. The Apache watched the sun climb higher before finally turning to the group. "We go back today," he said simply. "Before nightfall, this ends." The sheriff tightened the strap on his rifle. "You plan on marching right into that camp?" "I plan on walking in quiet," the Apache said. "But I won't walk out alone if it comes to that," the sheriff frowned. "You're talking suicide, friend." The Apache met his eyes, steady as stone. "Maybe, but if we don't stop them now, they'll come for the rest. Your people, your town." The boy's father shifted weakly, his voice rough. "He's right. They won't stop. They've got too much to lose." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Then we'll ride with him." The Apache shook his head. "No, you take the boy and his pa to safety. If we fail, someone has to warn the town." The sheriff looked ready to argue, but one look at the Apache's face told him it was useless. The man had already decided his path. By midday, the sun was brutal again, baking the land into a shimmering haze. They rode close to the canyon, keeping to the shadows, until they could see the mesa in the distance. The Apache dismounted, crouching low and scanning the horizon. The camp below was busier now. Wagons being loaded, soldiers moving about in tense formation. Something was happening. The sheriff joined him, squinting through the heat. Looks like they're getting ready to move out. The Apache nodded. They know someone was watching them last night. They'll cover their tracks before they go. What do you figure they'll do with the men in chains? The Apache's silence was answer enough. A tightness gripped the sheriff's chest. Then we move now. They left the horses tied behind the ridge and started on foot, slipping between rocks and dry brush, every movement careful. The Apache carried his rifle low, knife strapped to his leg. The sheriff followed close, heart pounding. Below, the sound of shouting grew louder. When they reached the edge of the camp, they could see everything clearly now. Soldiers were breaking down tents, shoving prisoners toward the wagons. A tall man in a dark coat stood near the largest tent barking orders. His posture was proud, rigid, the kind of man used to giving orders and never hearing no. That's him, the Apache said quietly. Captain Hurst. The sheriff looked closer. You sure? I've seen him before, the Apache said. He led the patrol that burned my village. The sheriff froze, looking at him sharply, but the Apache's expression didn't waver. His eyes were fixed on Hurst like a man staring down a ghost. The Apache moved first, slipping along the shadows of a supply wagon. The sheriff followed, crouching low. They made their way toward the big tent where a table stood covered in maps and papers. 2 guards stood watch nearby, but the Apache waited, patient as the land itself. When one stepped away to fetch water, he moved. A swift motion, silent as a whisper, and the guard was down. The other barely turned before the sheriff had the barrel of his revolver pressed against his chest. They dragged the bodies out of sight and slipped inside the tent. The air inside smelled of tobacco and dust. Papers covered the table, stamped with the army seal. The Apache flipped through them quickly, scanning the marks. What's it say? The sheriff whispered. Orders, the Apache said. Signed by the captain himself. They're mining gold under federal land, using prisoners to hide it from the government. The sheriff swore under his breath. That explains the wagons. He's moving the gold east, the Apache looked up sharply, and killing anyone who's seen too much. Just then, a shadow fell across the tent's entrance. The flap lifted and a voice said coldly, You boys seem lost. Captain Hurst stood there, revolver drawn, a faint smile playing across his lips. He was older than the Apache remembered, with a scar running down his cheek, but his eyes hadn't changed. They were hard, colorless, and cruel. The Apache didn't flinch. You still taking orders, Captain? He asked quietly. Or just stealing for yourself now? Hurst's smile widened. You've got nerve walking into my camp, Injun. Guess you don't value your life much. The sheriff raised his hand slightly, his voice calm. Nobody needs to die here. We just came for the truth. The truth, Hurst said with a laugh. Don't mean a damn thing out here. All that matters is who's left standing. He cocked his revolver, but before he could fire, the Apache moved. The gun went off, deafening in the small space, but the Apache was already inside his reach, knocking the pistol aside and driving his shoulder into Hurst's chest. They went down hard, crashing into the table, papers scattering like snow. The sheriff dove for the gun, firing a quick shot through the tent flap at the soldiers outside who'd heard the commotion. Chaos exploded. Shouts rang out. Boots pounded the dirt and smoke filled the air. The Apache and Hurst rolled across the ground, fists flying, neither giving an inch. The sheriff ducked behind a barrel, firing toward the entrance as more soldiers rushed in. The Apache grabbed Hurst's arm, twisting until the captain's gun fell loose. He swung once, hard, and Hurst staggered back into the pole of the tent, blood running from his nose. You remember what you did to my people? The Apache said through clenched teeth. Hurst laughed, even bleeding. You think you were the only one we broke? You're nothing but a ghost, son. You can't fight the army. The Apache's eyes burned. Then I'll fight the man behind it. Before Hurst could answer, another explosion rocked the camp. The Apache and sheriff froze, then looked toward the open flap. One of the wagons had caught fire, its crates bursting open as flames spread fast. Soldiers shouted, trying to put it out, but the fire raced from wagon to wagon, swallowing everything in heat and smoke. Time to go, the sheriff shouted. The Apache grabbed the papers from the table, shoving them into his coat. But Hurst lunged again, grabbing his arm. The two struggled, their boots kicking up dust. Hurst slammed the Apache against the pole, hand at his throat. You should have stayed dead, he snarled. The Apache's knife flashed once. Hurst staggered, eyes wide, clutching his side. The Apache caught him as he fell, breath rough. I tried, he said quietly. The sheriff grabbed his shoulder. "We gotta move!" They burst out into the chaos of the camp. Smoke choked the air, the heat fierce enough to blister. Prisoners were breaking loose, running in all directions as soldiers tried to rally. The Apache spotted the boy's father near one of the wagons, trying to help another man out of his chains. The sheriff yelled over the roar, "Get them out of here!" The Apache ran toward them, cutting through the smoke. The boy's father looked up, relief flashing in his eyes. "You found him?" The Apache nodded once. "He won't be giving any more orders." Gunfire cracked behind them. The sheriff was pinned near a burning tent, returning shots as the flames closed in. The Apache turned back, sprinting through the heat. He grabbed the sheriff's arm just as the tent gave way, pulling him free. They stumbled toward the ridge, the boy's father and the freed men following close. The camp was falling apart behind them. Explosions, shouts, the hiss of burning canvas. But over the chaos came a new sound, the low thunder of hooves. The Apache looked toward the east and saw riders cresting the hill, more soldiers, a full patrol, heading straight for them. "Reinforcements," he said. The sheriff's face drained of color. "We'll never outrun them." The Apache scanned the ridge, mind racing. "Then we don't run. We lead them into the canyon," he motioned to the men. "Get the prisoners moving north. Stay in the brush. Don't stop till you reach the river." The boy's father hesitated. "What about you?" The Apache tightened his grip on his rifle. "I'll make sure they follow me." The sheriff grabbed his arm. "You'll be killed." "Maybe," the Apache said, eyes steady. "But they'll think twice before they take another man from this land again." Before the sheriff could stop him, the Apache turned his horse toward the oncoming riders. Dust billowed behind him as he spurred forward, rifle in hand, heading straight into the mouth of danger. The sheriff watched him go, the sound of gunfire rising again in the distance. Smoke from the burning camp twisted into the sky, mixing with the red of the setting sun. He turned to the others, voice rough. "Let's move. He's buying us time." As they disappeared into the scrub, the echo of battle rolled through the valley, the crack of rifles, the thunder of hooves, and somewhere in the middle of it, the fierce cry of a man who refused to bow. The sheriff looked back one last time, just in time to see the Apache vanish into the haze of dust and fire, his silhouette swallowed by the smoke. The sound of gunfire grew louder, closer, until it filled the air like a storm about to break. And there, in the heart of the desert, under a sky turning red as blood, the fight that had been building since the day they took the boy's paw was finally coming to its breaking point. The wind carried the smoke far across the valley, twisting through the canyons and low hills until the air itself seemed painted with ash and light. The Apache rode hard into the heart of the storm, the ground trembling beneath the hooves of his horse. Gunfire cracked like thunder behind him. Dust stung his face, but he didn't slow. He knew these lands better than any man chasing him. Every bend, every hollow, every dry stream bed that could hide a man or swallow a horse whole. Behind him came the soldiers, a full patrol shouting orders through the haze. Their rifles flashed under the red sun. The Apache led them deeper into the canyon, where the cliffs closed in tight and the echo of their pursuit grew louder. His plan was simple: draw them far enough in that the others could escape, then vanish like smoke into the desert. As the canyon walls narrowed, he turned sharply and slipped into a side ravine where the shadows ran deep. He dismounted, slapping the horse to send it running. The soldiers followed the sound of hooves, not realizing he'd gone to ground. He crouched behind a boulder, rifle ready, heart pounding in time with the earth. When the first rider passed, he fired once. The man tumbled from his saddle. Another turned, shouting. But before he could aim, a second shot rang out, echoing sharp between the rocks. The rest scattered in confusion. The Apache moved like part of the land, silent, sure, patient. But there were too many of them. Gunfire tore through the ravine, bullets sparking off the stone. The Apache ducked low, crawling to a higher ridge. He could see them now, 8, maybe 9 riders trying to flank him. He steadied his rifle, taking careful aim. The next shot found its mark, dropping another man. Then he heard it, the sound of hooves approaching fast from behind. The sheriff, the man had refused to run after all. He came charging through the dust, firing from the saddle, yelling for the Apache to move. The soldiers turned their fire on him, and for a moment everything was chaos. Men shouting, horses screaming, dust and smoke and fire all tangled together. The Apache leapt from the ridge, rolling as he hit the ground, grabbing the reins of a fallen horse. He mounted fast and swung around beside the sheriff. Together they charged down the canyon, drawing the soldiers farther in. The walls rose higher now, steep and jagged, the path narrowing to little more than a funnel. "Keep riding," the Apache shouted. The sheriff looked at him, eyes wide with fear and dust. "What are you doing?" "Ending it." The Apache spurred his horse forward, pulling ahead. The sheriff knew better than to follow this time. He turned off the main trail, galloping up a rocky slope to cover, while the Apache rode straight into the canyon mouth. The soldiers chased him hard, unaware of what waited ahead. The canyon curved sharply, opening into a basin lined with loose shale and dry sand. It was the same place the Apache had seen years before, where the earth had given way after a storm, collapsing a ridge into a wall of stone. He remembered every inch of it. He turned in the saddle, fired one last shot toward the lead rider, and then galloped for the far side. The ground rumbled. A sharp crack split the air. The weight of the horses and men pounding through loosened the weakened rock. Dust poured down first, then the cliff itself began to move, slow and terrible. The Apache's horse stumbled but kept running. Behind him, the canyon exploded into noise and falling stone. When the sheriff reached the ridge above, he saw it all unfold. The soldiers disappeared in a cloud of dust as the canyon floor collapsed, the sound rolling like thunder through the desert. He watched helplessly, searching for the Apache's figure in the haze. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then, through the drifting smoke, he saw a lone rider emerge, barely hanging on, his horse limping, both coated in dust. The sheriff spurred his mount and rode down to meet him. The Apache slid from his saddle, stumbling as he hit the ground. Blood streaked his arm, his shirt torn, but he was alive. The sheriff caught him before he fell. "You did it," the sheriff said quietly. The Apache looked past him, toward the canyon. "They won't take any more men," he said. His voice was calm, steady. "It's finished." They stood there a while, watching the last of the dust settle. The boy's father and the freed prisoners appeared on the ridge above, waving to show they'd made it. Relief washed through the sheriff's chest like cold water. They made their way back slowly. The Apache refused help, walking beside his horse, head bowed. The sheriff rode beside him in silence. The sun dipped low, the sky glowing deep orange over the desert. Every shadow seemed longer, softer now, as though the land itself was finally resting. By the time they reached the camp where the others waited, night had settled in. The boy ran forward, throwing his arms around his pa, who knelt to hold him tight. The sight brought a quiet kind of ache to the sheriff's chest. The Apache stood apart from the firelight, watching them. The sheriff walked over and handed him a canteen. "You could stay a while," he said. "Town'll want to thank you." The Apache shook his head. "I'm not looking for thanks. Then what are you looking for?" The Apache's eyes drifted toward the horizon. "Peace," he said simply. The sheriff nodded. "Ain't much of that left out here." The Apache gave a faint smile. "Then I'll find what little there is." They stood in silence for a while, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of wind through the brush. The boy's father came over, leaning heavily on a stick. "You saved us," he said to the Apache. "All of us." The Apache didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed on the fire. "Your boy saved you first," he said finally. "He had more courage than most grown men." The man smiled faintly, glancing toward his son. "Maybe so, but I reckon he learned that from watching someone else." The Apache looked away, his expression unreadable. After a while, he stepped back and said quietly, "I'll leave before dawn." The sheriff wanted to argue, but he didn't. He knew the man didn't belong to any town or army. He belonged to the land, the canyons, the wind, the silence that carried stories older than anyone alive could remember. Before dawn came, the Apache saddled his horse. The sheriff was already awake, sitting by the dying fire. He rose and walked over. "Where'll you go?" The Apache glanced east. "Where the rivers still run. Maybe the mountains," the sheriff nodded slowly. "If you ever ride back this way, you'll have friends waiting." The Apache mounted up, reins loose in his hands. "Take care of the boy," he said. "He's seen too much for his years." "I will," the sheriff said. The Apache gave one last look toward the sleeping camp, then turned his horse toward the open desert. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting the land gold. His figure grew smaller as he rode away, until he was only a dark shape against the rising light. The sheriff watched until he was gone, then turned back toward the camp. The boy's father was stirring the ashes of the fire, humming something soft. The sheriff took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, the loss, the courage, the strange bond that had formed between men who should have been enemies but chose to fight together instead. Weeks later, when they made it back to town, the people listened wide-eyed as the sheriff told the story. They called it the Canyon Stand. Some didn't believe it, but those who'd seen the smoke rising that day said the land itself had trembled. The boy grew quieter after that, but stronger too, carrying his father's spirit and the memory of the man who'd risked everything for them. Every so often, the sheriff would ride out past the ridge at sunset and look toward the horizon. Sometimes he thought he saw a rider in the distance, a faint figure moving through the dust. Maybe it was just the wind and the play of light, but in his heart, he liked to believe the Apache was still out there, somewhere between the hills and the sky, watching over the land that had taken so much from him yet still gave him reason to keep going. The land healed slow. The gold wagons never made it east, and word spread that the canyon was cursed. No one tried to mine it again. Nature reclaimed what men had burned. The wildflowers returned in spring, the riverbeds filled after storms, and the desert grew quiet again. And sometimes when the wind carried across those hills, it sounded like the echo of hooves and a voice calling faint through the dust, strong, proud, unbroken. A reminder that justice, in that rough and lonely land, didn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it rode alone, silent as the sunrise, leaving only the promise that no man, no matter how forgotten, would go unavenged. That was the end of it, or maybe the beginning of something else. Out there in the old American West, where the earth still remembers the footsteps of those who came before, the story of the lone Apache lived on. It wasn't written in books or carved in stone, but carried in whispers and wind, passed from one campfire to another. A story about loss, about courage, and about how even in the harshest land, one man's fight for what's right could change everything.